What happens when a decorated black detective becomes the target of his own department's bias? A tense standoff, a crowd with cameras, and a shocking truth that changes everything captured in real time. Will the system protect one of its own, or will prejudice prevail? A powerful story of bias, courage, and the fight for change. If you like this content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories. The air was crisp as Detective Malcolm Carter stepped out of his car, fatigue pulling at every muscle after an unforgiving 12-hour shift. A small corner store sat at the edge of the block, glowing faintly under its flickering neon sign. Malcolm rubbed his hands together for warmth and adjusted the hood of his red sweatshirt over his head. He had no idea that in less than 10 minutes his life would take a turn he hadn't signed up for. Across the street, Officer Ethan Monroe sat in his patrol car, chewing on a toothpick and scanning the sidewalk like a hawk. His radio crackled with updates on a nearby robbery, a suspect described vaguely as a black male wearing dark clothing. Monroe leaned forward when his eyes landed on Malcolm. To Monroe, it all clicked in the worst way possible. A hoodie, a mask, black. The cop's pulse quickened, a cocktail of adrenaline and bias rushing to his head. He didn't see a man heading home after a long day. He saw a suspect. Malcolm stepped into the store, grabbing a bottle of water and a pack of gum, paying without much thought. He offered a polite nod to the cashier before heading back out. The chill in the night bit harder as he made his way down the block, but something about the street felt different now. A shadow in the distance, a car crawling just a bit too slow. The flash of red and blue lights froze the scene. "Stop right there. Hands where I can see them." A voice barked, sharp and unwavering. Malcolm's heart sank. He turned, seeing Officer Monroe step out of the patrol car, hand on his holstered weapon. The street seemed to shrink, and the sound of murmuring voices began to rise as people gathered, pulling out their phones. But what Monroe didn't know was that Malcolm Carter wasn't just any man in a hoodie. He was a cop too, and this confrontation was about to become a moment neither of them would forget. Malcolm stood still, his hands slowly rising to eye level. He could feel the cool night air brushing against his skin, the distant chatter of onlookers starting to grow louder. His mind raced. Why was he being stopped? He hadn't done anything wrong. His badge was tucked inside his jacket, but he knew the protocol. A calm, respectful approach was key. Monroe's eyes never wavered from Malcolm's face. He was quick to make assumptions, and those assumptions had been set into motion the moment he saw Malcolm walking down the street. In his mind, the hoodie, the mask, and the night were a perfect storm of suspicion. "You match the description of a robbery suspect." Monroe spat, voice tight. "You know what I'm talking about. Hands where I can see them." Malcolm's gaze hardened, but he didn't flinch. He'd been through enough tense situations in his career to know how to handle this. Slowly he reached under his jacket and produced his badge. "I'm Detective Malcolm Carter," he said, keeping his voice even, but his frustration was starting to bubble under the surface. "I'm off duty." Monroe didn't even blink. His hand hovered over his gun, his posture brimming with a sense of superiority. "You think I'm going to buy that? You don't look like a cop." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He had been through worse. He'd dealt with so many situations where his very identity as a black officer had been questioned by people who didn't know him. But this time it was different. This time, he was being accused in his own neighborhood by someone who should have known better. "I'm telling you the truth," Malcolm replied, a steady calmness in his voice. "I'm a cop." He lifted the badge again, his eyes locking with Monroe's, trying to get through to him. But Monroe wasn't listening. His suspicion had clouded his judgment, and he wasn't willing to back down. Malcolm could see it in his eyes. This was about control. The small crowd of people that had gathered began murmuring. Phones were pointed their way. The scene slowly turning into a spectacle. They'd seen this before. Police officers confronting people in their neighborhood, questioning authority without reason. Some of them knew Malcolm, but none of them could be sure of how this would play out. But Monroe's refusal to listen was pushing things into dangerous territory, and Malcolm's frustration was about to reach a boiling point. On the ground now, Monroe's voice echoed across the block, sharp and unrelenting. He pulled his gun, pointing it squarely at Malcolm. The murmurs in the crowd turned into gasps. A woman's voice called out, He didn't do anything. Another man shouted, "What's wrong with you, officer?" Phones were now raised high, capturing every movement, every word. Malcolm raised both hands higher, keeping his stance calm but firm. His voice didn't shake. "I'm Detective Carter. I've already told you. I'm on your side." He pointed toward the badge in his hand, his motion slow and deliberate. Monroe's lip curled as he stepped closer. "A fake badge doesn't prove anything. If you're really a cop, why are you dressed like that? Why the mask?" Malcolm couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd spent years defending his community, walking the line between his duty as an officer and his identity as a black man. And now here he was, treated like a criminal for wearing a hoodie and trying to stay warm. "Because it's cold," Malcolm replied, keeping his tone measured, "and because I just finished a 12-hour shift protecting people like you." The tension in the air was electric. Malcolm could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, and the phones recording every second only made the situation feel heavier. But he wasn't about to lose his composure. "I don't want this to escalate," Malcolm said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "But you need to lower your weapon. I'm not armed, and I'm not your suspect." The crowd began to close in, their anger simmering. "We're all watching," one man yelled. A few others chimed in, shouting at Monroe to back off, but Monroe, now feeling cornered, refused to budge. His face twisted in a mix of arrogance and insecurity. He turned toward the crowd, barking at them to step back. Malcolm seized a moment. "If you're going to arrest me, do it. But you better be sure, because everyone here is filming this. And when they see you made a mistake, it won't just be me you'll have to answer to." Monroe faltered for a moment, glancing at the phones pointed in his direction. His grip on the gun loosened slightly, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. But the situation was far from resolved. Monroe wasn't ready to let go, and backup was already on its way. The sound of sirens cut through the night like a blade, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was arriving. The tension on the street thickened as more officers pulled up in their squad cars. The crowd, emboldened by their numbers and their cameras, didn't back away. Instead, their voices grew louder, a collective demand for accountability. Malcolm stood his ground, his arms still raised. His mind raced through the scenarios he'd seen unfold too many times, how these moments spiraled out of control when cooler heads didn't prevail. He took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. 3 officers emerged from the squad cars, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. They assessed the scene: Monroe, gun drawn, shouting, a man in a red hoodie, hands raised, calm but resolute, and a crowd that was visibly on edge. "What's going on here, Monroe?" one of the officers asked, stepping closer. "This man matches a description of a suspect from a robbery earlier tonight." Monroe snapped. "He's refusing to comply." Malcolm's voice broke through, steady and firm. "I'm Detective Malcolm Carter. I've identified myself multiple times. My badge is in my hand. This is a misunderstanding, and it's escalating unnecessarily." The other officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a sergeant, stepped forward. Her sharp eyes darted between Monroe and Malcolm, taking in the scene with practiced precision. "Monroe, lower your weapon," she ordered. "He could be lying," Monroe protested, his voice rising. "And if he's not," the sergeant shot back. Her voice carried the weight of authority, but there was a subtle edge of frustration. She turned to Malcolm. "Detective Carter, do you have any additional ID?" Malcolm carefully reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his department-issued ID card and handing it over. The sergeant examined it closely, then turned back to Monroe. "Monroe," she said, her voice low and controlled. "This man is who he says he is. Stand down." The crowd erupted in shouts, some cheering, others demanding answers. Monroe hesitated, his grip tightening on his gun as though letting go would strip him of control. Finally, he lowered it, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. Malcolm exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. But he wasn't done yet. "Sergeant, I want this incident documented," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Everything that happened here. There's a crowd full of witnesses and cameras to back it up." The sergeant nodded. "We'll handle it." She turned to Monroe, her tone sharp. You, on the other hand, have some serious explaining to do. But while the immediate threat had passed, the impact of what just happened was only beginning to unfold. The sergeant stepped closer to Monroe, her voice dropping just enough to convey the gravity of the moment without letting the crowd hear. "You've crossed a line tonight," she said firmly. "This isn't just going to go away." Monroe, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, barely managed to respond. His hands trembled as he holstered his weapon, the reality of what had just happened starting to sink in. Around him, the crowd grew louder, their voices now an undeniable force. "You thought you could get away with this," someone shouted. "Not today," another chimed in. Malcolm adjusted his stance, lowering his hands but keeping his badge visible. His breathing had steadied, but the frustration was still raw. He met Monroe's gaze, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. "This could have ended so much worse," Malcolm said, his tone measured but sharp. "And for what? A hunch?" The sergeant turned back to Malcolm, her face softening slightly. "Detective Carter, I'm sorry this happened. We'll take care of it." Malcolm nodded, but said nothing. Apologies in situations like this fell hollow, no matter how well-intentioned. What mattered now was accountability and the truth. As the officers began dispersing the crowd, one of the younger officers approached Monroe, his voice low but firm. "Man, they're all recording. You better hope none of this goes viral." It was too late for that. Videos were already spreading online, some even being live-streamed. The faces of Monroe and Malcolm were now etched into phones, laptops, and social media feeds across the country. Malcolm walked over to the sergeant, his voice calm but resolute. "This can't just be swept under the rug. People need to know what happened here." "I understand," the sergeant replied, her tone serious. "An internal investigation will be launched immediately. And, Detective Carter, I'm going to need your statement." Malcolm nodded. "You'll have it." The crowd began to thin out, some people lingering to exchange words with Malcolm. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his phone still in hand. "Detective Carter, you handled that with grace," he said, "but we need more people like you calling this out." Malcolm gave a faint smile, though his heart was heavy. "Appreciate it, but it shouldn't have to be this way." But while the scene was winding down, the real fallout was about to begin, and this wouldn't be over until real change was forced to the surface. By the next morning, the videos had spread like wildfire. Headlines across the country painted a stark picture. Plainclothes, black detective held at gunpoint by fellow officer. The footage was unavoidable on news outlets, social media, and even morning talk shows. Every angle of the encounter was analyzed, dissected, and debated. Malcolm sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers offering support. But for every message of solidarity, there was another comment online questioning his actions, his authority, even his humanity. He turned the TV off and leaned back, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He didn't ask for the spotlight, but now it was here, glaring and relentless. The department moved quickly to mitigate the damage. Officer Monroe was placed on administrative leave, pending an investigation, though many felt it was a slap on the wrist. Public protests erupted outside the precinct, with community leaders demanding accountability and systemic change. Malcolm reluctantly agreed to an interview, sitting down with a local journalist who asked him what the experience had taught him. He paused for a moment before answering. "It taught me that the badge doesn't make you immune to prejudice. It taught me that even when you're part of the system can still turn on you." The interviewer nodded, her face solemn. "And what do you hope comes out of this?" Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "Accountability. Not just for Monroe, but for every officer who lets bias cloud their judgment. We can't build trust with the community if we keep tearing it down in moments like this." The department held a press conference shortly after, with the chief of police promising a full review of the incident and an overhaul of bias training. But promises like these had been made before, and the public wasn't quick to forget. For Malcolm, the days that followed were a mix of relief and frustration. While some people hailed him as a hero, others accused him of overreacting or playing the victim. He knew the truth wasn't about heroism or victimhood. It was about doing what was right, even when it was exhausting. One evening, Malcolm visited a local community center where young kids and teens gathered. A boy, no older than 12, approached him. "Are you the guy from the video?" the boy asked. Malcolm knelt down to meet his eyes. "Yeah, that's me." "Why didn't you get mad?" the boy asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Because getting mad wouldn't have helped. Sometimes staying calm is the strongest thing you can do." The boy nodded slowly, as though he was absorbing the lesson. But for Malcolm, the real lesson was this: change doesn't happen overnight. But every small moment of accountability pushes the needle just a little further. A week later, Malcolm sat on a park bench, watching the sunset as the city buzzed faintly in the background. The incident with Monroe had left him drained, but it had also sparked something in him, a determination to use his voice for something greater. He thought back to the boy at the community center and the questions he'd asked. In that child's curiosity, Malcolm saw the future, a generation that could grow up learning to do better, to treat others with respect and empathy, regardless of assumptions. He picked up his phone and started typing, crafting a post to the department's social media page. This isn't just about one moment or one mistake. It's about the choices we make every day, whether to act on fear or take a step back and think. I want to thank everyone who stood up, recorded what happened, and demanded accountability. Change starts with us, and we owe it to our communities to do better. Let's keep pushing for justice, one step at a time. He hit send, leaning back against the bench. The road ahead was long, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The moral of this story is simple. Accountability matters, and change begins with confronting uncomfortable truths. It's not enough to wear a badge or claim good intentions. Our actions define us. So as you watch this, ask yourself, what assumptions do you carry? How can you challenge them? And most importantly, how can you be a part of change that creates a fairer, more compassionate world? So as you watch this, ask yourself, what assumptions do you carry? How can you challenge them? And most importantly, how can you be a part of change that creates a fairer, more compassionate world? If you believe in accountability and standing up for what's right, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that spark reflection and inspire action.